Honorable Minister, Your Excellencies, experts and resource people from the region, distinguished ladies and gentlemen. There are almost everybody, I suspect, in the room is far better versed than I am on matters related to security. And so I'm going to really focus on economic issues, which I know a little bit about. I hope I can add some value to the discussions today. And the question I posed myself when my good friend Lakshman asked me to speak is that what is happening in terms of the dynamics of the Bay of Bengal region, which may be changing the prospects of the countries of the region. As you know, South Asia is the least integrated region in the world. If you look at trade, you look at investment, it's less integrated than every other region and sub-region in the world. And even the BIMSTEC region hasn't got the traction I suspect all of us hoped it would. So what are the prospects of things changing? That's really the question I tried to answer, and let me share some thoughts which are very preliminary and rather stream of consciousness-like, but for what it's worth, let me share them with you. I think it's realistic to say that within the SAARC framework, progress will continue to be very muted. There's much we in this region can learn from East Asia. There is a somewhat troubled history between Japan and Korea. There's somewhat troubled history between Japan and China, but it doesn't stop them from doing billions and billions of dollars worth of business. There are tremendously strong commercial relations among those three countries. In South Asia, we have not been able to transcend our historical legacy. I think the difference is that the East Asians are very pragmatic and very focused on commercial advantage. In South Asia, we tend to be rather emotional and somewhat easily distracted. That's the difference. And that's not going to change in the near future. Certainly not, I suspect, in my lifetime. So what about the rest of the Bay of Bengal region? There, I suspect the narrative is different. There are changes which we are already beginning to see, which I think are opening up new possibilities. Already, if you look at the northeast of the subcontinent, you look at rail and road transit, you look at energy grid sharing, you look at even water sharing now. There is progress being made between India, Bangladesh, Nepal, Bhutan, etc. So there is real progress, which wasn't there maybe 5 years ago. In the south, we've had some progress we've made in terms of grid connectivity. And of course, Sri Lanka and India are negotiating the Economic and Technical Cooperation Agreement, ETCA, which I think can be a very useful template for other countries in the Bay of Bengal region as well. Arguably, the biggest change factor is really India's posture in the region. I'll take the political and then the economic changes in the dynamics of India's position vis-a-vis its neighborhood. I suspect India's neighborhood first policy is rooted, at least in part, to a clear recognition that instability and friction in the neighborhood will compromise India's ambitions as a global power, as a rising global player. So it's in India's interest to invest in the peace and security of the region. And I think, and there seems to be a consensus across the major political groups in India. The last two governments have both been committed to the neighborhood. And that, I think, really opens up a lot of opportunities by changing the overall landscape within which bilateral relations within the, particularly the Bay of Bengal region, are evolving. There are also changes as far as the economic dimensions are concerned. Again, spreading out from what is happening in India. If you recall, the rise of first Japan and then China pulled the whole of East and Southeast Asia up along with them. Economists talk about this wild geese formation, where first Japan was the lead goose, and then China and the other countries followed, largely through cross-border production sharing arrangements, the various supply chains that were created as Japanese and then Chinese manufacturing came to dominate the world. We haven't had that kind of scenario. India's growth has been muted. It's been at a higher level since 1991. But more recently, now that the effects of demonetization are wearing out and the glitches with the general services tax are being resolved, there is now the prospect of India, which is already the fastest growing large economy in the world, being able to sustain 7% plus growth for some time. And if that happens, that should create opportunities for the countries in the world, particularly if India's Make in India strategy gains traction, because that will then create the supply chains and the cross-border production sharing arrangements which we've seen to the east of us being replicated in the Bay of Bengal region as well. So these are all important changes that are taking place, which have in many ways transformed the opportunities that are possible for countries in the Bay of Bengal region. Historically, particularly the small countries in the region have tended, and as small countries which are neighbors to much larger countries all over the world feel, have historically thought of India as much as a threat as an opportunity. But now I think the way India's political interests, global interests on the one hand, and its economic development on the other are evolving, I think the opportunities far outweighs any potential threat. But clearly those of us in the region would need to be sensitive to India's geopolitical interests. I think we in Sri Lanka have learnt the hard way that there are some red lines that one needs to be conscious of. That is the reality of geography, which we can't get away from. So, provided we can have good communication at all times, understand each other's sensitivities, I think the political developments and the economic impetus that we're seeing in India does create opportunities for the rest of the countries in the Bay of Bengal region. Let me finish by saying why I think the economic and technical cooperation agreement that Sri Lanka is negotiating with India can be used as a template for other countries in the region. Whenever small countries negotiate bilateral agreements with much larger countries, clearly there is genuine concern, and I think understandable concern, about the asymmetry of the economies involved. So how does one deal with that asymmetry so that you get a win-win situation whereby the smaller country also benefits? Unfortunately, there is, we don't need to reinvent the wheel. There are other agreements from which we can learn. And one lesson is the agreement between a smaller and larger country must be based on the principle of non-reciprocity and special and differential treatment. What that means in practice is that the smaller country would have much longer negative lists when it comes to trade in goods, much shorter positive lists when it comes to trade in services, and the smaller country will have much longer transition periods in terms of the liberalization that has been agreed as part of the trade deal. So there are safeguard arrangements and anti-dumping laws which you can introduce. Sri Lanka has just introduced an anti-dumping and safeguards provisions law. What the safeguard provisions do is you can set a limit in terms of an import surge. You can say if imports grow faster than 15% in a year, you can trigger off some tariffs. So that this is again protection that a small country can have in terms of safeguards. And also, clearly anti-dumping legislation is necessary to ensure that there isn't any industry which is adversely affected by dumping, by being swamped by cheap imports. So there are these well-known principles as well as mechanisms that can be used to ensure that the smaller country does get a decent deal when negotiating with the larger country. One can also build in a robust dispute resolution mechanism. This is very important. You see, let's assume that there is no agreement between Sri Lanka and India, and other countries also don't have agreements with India. The Indian economy is going to continue to grow and grow fast. The asymmetry between India and its neighbors is going to increase. In such a context, it's in the interest of the smaller country to have a rules-based framework within which trade, investment, etc. takes place. Because, if you don't have those rules, given the size of the Indian economy, given the rate of growth India is going to record, it'll be a much more untidy and potentially more disruptive process if you don't have a rules-based framework to govern the bilateral relationship between the two countries. In fact, it's not often understood that rules-based frameworks are actually the protection for small and vulnerable countries. If you can, the more rules-based frameworks you can have to determine bilateral and international relations, the greater protection there is for relatively small countries. So there's a very, very strong rationale for putting this bilateral relationship, not only Sri Lanka, but whether it's Nepal, whether it's Bangladesh, whether it's Bhutan, whether it's Myanmar, to put the relationship with a much larger player in the region, with the fast-growing player in the region, within a rules-based framework, and whereby the relationships between the smaller countries and India can evolve within a predictable and stable environment. Finally, let me talk a little bit about Trincomalee. Clearly, if the Bay of Bengal region takes off, the strategic importance of Trincomalee, which has been known for millennia, would be reinforced even further. Not only just the port, which would which is very well placed to be a hub for the Bay of Bengal region, but also the hinterland. The hinterland around Trincomalee can be developed, whereby it can become an engine of growth, not only for Sri Lanka, but for the broader region as well. So to sum up, as I said, there are others in the room who are going to be talking about the strategic and security aspects of the Bay of Bengal region. From my point of view, there are a number of trends which are playing themselves out, which have increased the potential for countries in the Bay of Bengal region to grasp opportunities which are now there, which have emerged, which were perhaps not there 5-10 years ago. And so the challenge now is to grasp these opportunities, to negotiate effectively, to make sure that each of our national interests are pursued vigorously within a cooperative framework. Thank you all very much.